Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for coming today for our last chapter. The subject of Chapter 12 is assessment. I think it's a very important chapter for any number of reasons. First of all, you will be held accountable to a large extent for the grades you assign your students. And certainly these grades need to be assigned on the most valid and most reliable information possible. And we glean that information from whatever assessment instruments we use to evaluate students. It's also important because students' futures in life decisions really are governed to some extent by the grades they receive. I have a friend who says that the main purpose of American education is sorting, and that from the time they begin kindergarten, we really sort them into groups, advanced groups, slow groups, fast groups, special interest groups, and all. We have all kinds of labels for the variety of ways that we sort people into post-secondary institutions, which one will go to universities, which ones will go to prestigious universities, which ones will go to junior colleges, which ones will go to trade schools. So certainly whether it is the intent of education or not to engage in sorting, that's certainly oftentimes the result of what we do. And we depend largely on decisions that we make based on the instruments we use to assess and evaluate their achievement in a whole variety of arenas. And so I want you to start thinking today about how you think students can most fair and equitably be evaluated, because it's going to be just a year or two till you're in a position to make those decisions yourself. And for my focus question today, I want to ask you a question that has probably impacted you in your life, and that is, how many of you think if a student turns his paper in late that he or she should have points removed? You think you should take points away?
Depends on the situation.
So he says it depends on the situation. How many of you have had points removed from your work because you either forgot to turn it in or turned it in late? How did you feel about it when that happened to you?
I thought I was stupid for turning it in late.
Well, when we talked about punishment, that's the first step. And for punishment to be effective, remember during the week that we talked about punishment? And step one is that you have to identify what caused the punishment. And second of all, you have to distinguish your responsibility in that situation for being responsible for the punishment. So in your case, it worked fairly well for you because you felt stupid and probably vowed to do better next time. I also would imagine that you were probably a pretty good student, and grades were pretty important to you. So when you had points taken off of your paper because it was late, or because you didn't write your name on it or follow some other procedure like neatness, there are all kinds of things that teachers deduct points from. It was a motivator for you because you perceived yourself to be a good student, perceived yourself to be capable of earning good grades, and thought good grades were very important. So sometimes when we take points off of students' work or punish them for other citizenship traits with their grades, sometimes it works. But usually it works for the people who are really good students to start with. If that had been effective, if turning your work in late was a motivator for low-achieving students, the whole world would be a different place, right? Most of the time they've already decided they're not going to make good grades anyway, and so they don't care. I had a situation in Quest 2 one time where a girl was very adamant about taking points off of students' grades if they didn't turn their names in on their papers, and guess what? When she turned in her portfolio, she forgot to put her name on her paper, on her box. And back then we had boxes, it wasn't all done electronically, and so I had an opportunity to ask her to re-examine her position and make a determination about whether or not she thought her portfolio ought to be a reflection of the work that she had accumulated over the course of the semester, or whether it should be a reflection of whether or not she could remember to write her name on the box. And so it was sort of a good demonstration point for my position in this matter. Of course, I'm not very much in favor of any kind of punishment for motivation, because mostly it doesn't work for the students who need it most. So I'm not a big advocate of punishment, not because I don't like punishment, but because it doesn't work very well. But in this particular case, I'm not in favor of taking points off of students' grades for leaving their names off or turning it in late or having a messy paper or whatever, for one reason only. And that is that when we conduct an assessment of a student's work, our primary objective is not to determine whether they have good citizenship traits. Our primary objective is to determine how much they know about computing math equations, or how much they know about reading and understanding what they've read, or how much they know about science or social studies or whatever. We have another whole area on our report card that is devoted to citizenship traits. That whole right side of most report cards ask if you're on time, if you're punctual, if you're responsible, if you're cooperative, if you're flexible, if you are a good citizen of an academic community. But when we assess a student's academic work, our primary objective ought to be to determine the extent to which they've mastered the instructional objectives that we identified as being important for them to master. So in this particular case, I wouldn't agree with taking points off for reasons other than lack of achievement. I also think it's not very effective at motivating most of the people who don't do it, though I don't question that it is an effective way of reminding students who are good achievers that it's important to be punctual and on time and these sorts of things. But in any event, that's something for you to think about as we move into a full discussion of Chapter 12, which begins with the types of tests that teachers have available for use in this arena. And certainly there are many of them. We will be discussing several different types today. And it's important for you to bear in mind that a test in and of itself is not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. We have lots, tests are very controversial right now. For one reason, we're in an era of very high stakes testing. The consequences of you not passing your exit exam, for example, are very high. I mean, if you don't pass your exit exam, you can't be a teacher in Texas. If students don't master the talks, all sorts of bad things happen to them. They can't be promoted in school. Their teachers are punished because hers or her class made low grades. I mean, schools have signs on them that basically say you're a horrible place to be because your students weren't exemplary, or one of the other categories we've invented to give some sort of an artificial importance to these tax results, which are really just minimum competency tests. But nevertheless, the stakes for doing well on them are very high. So testing is a very controversial issue now, and has been for many years, but certainly since the passage of No Child Left Behind Act of 2000. So all of you will be impacted by a test, and it's important for you to learn to look at a test and make decisions about its usefulness to you. And in that regard, I would like for you to start thinking about tests in the same way you think about a piece of furniture. Right now in here, all of you are sitting in a chair. I mean, the chairs all resemble each other, and so you're having pretty much the same chair experience, right? What do you think about your chair? Do you like your chair? Is it a good chair? Can't be too bad. You're too neutral about it. I mean, is this a good chair or not? What's it good for? Well, I'm going to make all y'all sit on the floor. What is your chair good for?
Comfortable.
It's comfortable for what?
For listening to the teacher.
It's comfortable if you want to sit up and listen. What else is it good for? It's not too uncomfortable if you stay in it for a long time. It has a lot of flexibility. I see several of you rocking in your chairs, and it gives quite a bit. So it's not bad for that. It's not bad for writing, apparently. You don't seem to be experiencing too much discomfort when you sit in this chair and write. What if you wanted to take a nap? It's not too good for taking a nap. You're leaning back trying to catch a few winks now, but you just can hardly do it, can you? You'd almost have to put your head down on your desk in order to sleep in that chair. It's just no good for sleeping. Even though it leans back and is pretty comfortable for rocking, it just won't go back far enough for sleeping, will it? So that chair, I mean, for sitting at a desk writing, it's not too bad. I'm grateful to say that for sleeping, it's not too good. I didn't have that in mind for you for the next couple of hours sleeping. On the other hand, if you had a recliner, that would probably be a wonderful chair if you wanted to take a nap, wouldn't it? I mean, I've known people who've slept half of their lives in recliners. But if you were sitting in a recliner trying to write at this desk, it wouldn't be too good, would it? On the other hand, if you had to eat lunch in this chair with no table, it would be terrible, wouldn't it? You'd have a terrible time juggling your food. So we can't really say that your chair is good, or that a recliner is good, or that an armchair is good, or that an armless chair is good, unless we know the context in which that chair is going to be used. And tests are very much the same way. We hear people say very controversial, IQ tests are terrible, they say. IQ tests are terrible. Well, I don't know that IQ tests are terrible. There are certainly some validity issues that we know impact intelligence tests, and certainly they probably don't measure certainly the full extent to what we know is intelligence. But if we want to predict how well a student is likely to do in school, then his IQ score is probably going to be a fairly significant indicator. So even though it may not be an absolute measure of what we know intelligence to be, it may, on the other hand, be a fairly significant predictor of how successful that child will be in school. It may also tell us some outcome events of children. If we know that their measurable IQ on a well standardized and norm-referenced intelligence test, and one that is individually administered, falls in the range between 50 and 70, we can make some judgments about the type of education that might be the most appropriate for that child, and what kinds of vocational outcomes might be reasonable for him, and so on and so forth. So while we can say on the one hand an IQ test may not be good for ascertaining the exact level of intellectual capacity somebody has. We know that it does give us some meaningful information when we are judging students' performance relative to one another in school. So what I want you to start thinking about is that tests and all kinds of assessment instruments that we use in school have some good qualities and some bad qualities, and whether or not they're useful to us at any given point in time depends to a large extent on what our needs are and what uses the test results will be put to. And then we can make an adjustment about, well, this is a good test for that purpose, because there are different kinds of tests. They each serve different purposes, and as a teacher, it's important for you to understand what kinds of information specific tests can provide and what they will not be able to help you with. Regardless of the test you use, we also know that students with disabilities tend to perform better on teacher-made tests, standardized tests, norm-referenced tests, and tests of all kinds, measures of all kinds of their knowledge and ability if the examiner is familiar to them. Oftentimes, youngsters are insecure in testing situations, and they are intimidated and they're fearful that they will do poorly. So having a familiar examiner is often an important variable for increasing their performance and making a more accurate evaluation of their knowledge. Now, your book talks about several kinds of tests. I'm going to go over them briefly, and then some of them we're going to talk about in greater detail. But these are terminologies and things that you will need to know, not only because you need to know about these kinds of tests and what choices are available to you in evaluating student performance, but also this learning this sort of vocabulary will be important for you to function as an effective teacher in the schools, because you're going to hear these terms bandied around for the foreseeable future, and also you will be held accountable for a great deal of this type knowledge when it comes to taking your exit exam, because there are several questions on there. We are so interested now in student outcomes that teachers are really being pressured to become competent in knowing and knowing how to use the variety of tests that are available. One type of test that you will hear about quite a bit are standardized and norm-referenced tests. You often hear those words issued in the same breath: standardized, norm-referenced. But standardized is one thing and norm-referenced is something entirely different. And it's very important that you know what each one of those adjectives means in the overall context of test construction and test administration. When we say that a test is standardized, we are talking about tests that are constructed and administered very much like the SAT or the ACT, or our individualized IQ test, standardized achievement tests like the Iowa Test of Basic Skills, which some of you probably took when you were a student, or the Metropolitan Achievement Test, the California Achievement Test. Each of these is important tests that can be that are standardized and norm-referenced. When we say standardized, what we mean is that the test is constructed and administered in exactly the same way for everybody who takes it. They take the same test and they take the test under the same conditions. So when you go in to take the SAT and you sit down, you'll remember that everybody was allowed to have a wristwatch and 3 sharpened number 2 lead pencils and nothing else on your desk. And you'll remember that the examiner sat there and watched the clock on the wall till it was exactly 10 a.m. and at exactly 10 a.m. you were allowed to start, and then you were given 15-minute warning before the test was over, and then at exactly 4 o'clock or whatever it was you were required to close your booklet. That's referred to as standardization. The notion that every single person has either an identical test or an equivalent form of that test. And when the test is administered, every single person has exactly the same amount of time, exactly the same number of response options, and so on and so forth. So that's what the standard means in standardized. It means the test is constructed the same and administered the same for everybody. Norm referenced, on the other hand, refers to something that is entirely different. Norm referenced means that the score you earned is in fact referred to a wide group of scores that are representative of others in your same peer group, either others in your same grade or others at your same age level or whatever. So if you are looking up a raw score on the 5th grade achievement test, you would go to the norm for 5th graders. Now, this is a randomized sample of 5th graders who are assumed to be representative of all the kids in the different geographic regions, with different socioeconomic status levels, with different ethnicities, with different language preferences. A random sample of all 5th graders and the scores that they made on this test. So your score as a 5th grader is then referred to this randomized sample of scores, and we say, aha, this student did much better than average, this student did much worse than average. Usually these scores are reported, in addition to other things, in percentile rankings. So if it is an intelligence test or an aptitude test, you're in addition to having your IQ reported, it will tell you what percentile you're in, or how many students out of 100 would be likely to score higher than you, and how many out of 100 might be expected to score lower than you. Does that make sense? If it's an achievement test, and you were that 5th grader that we spoke about a minute ago, we might refer your scores back to the normative group of 5th graders and find out that you scored at the 6th grade first month level. And here it is only the 10th month of the 5th grade. So we would say, hey, you score a little bit above average for other students your own age who are in the 5th grade. And that would put you at about the 58th percentile. Of all 5th graders, about 42 of them would score higher than you, and about 58 would score lower than you, right? Or 57, I guess it would be in this particular case. But the idea behind standardized norm reference test is very important, because if you want to know how a student compares with others his own age throughout the country, the best information you can get is probably from a standardized norm reference test. On the other hand, it doesn't tell you very much about how well he's likely to do in his reading group tomorrow, because you don't know very much about his peer group, his classroom, his teacher expectations, his history of grades, or whatever. You may have a student who's fully capable of scoring at the above average, but who does very little when he's in the classroom. So standardized norm reference tests give you a good idea about a child's ability and how he may compare to others throughout the country, but it doesn't tell you very much about how he's likely to do tomorrow. A criterion reference test, on the other hand, is likely to give you more information about student performance that is compared to the specific criteria that he's expected to learn at any given point in time. Many of our teacher-made tests are criterion referenced, and some of our textbooks have criterion reference tests that accompany them. And more they do, because the assessment, back when I was teaching schools, test manufacturers didn't provide you with any tests, but now they come with a fairly elaborate set of tests usually, because there's so much emphasis on testing and teachers are required to do this with such efficiency. So many of them have materials that accompany the book. The test bank that comes with your book in here is a criterion reference test. It doesn't ask you any questions about the material in the Kirk special ed book. It only asks the questions about the ones in the book we're using now, the specific chapter-wise content that we cover on a weekly basis. So we have these two kinds of tests in school that are relied upon very heavily for very different purposes. In addition to that, teachers often engage in some specific types of information that are germane only to the curriculum and instructional objectives that they are working on with students at any given time. One of those is summative evaluation. For example, if you are a second grade teacher and you're teaching a social studies or an integrated unit on transportation, you may have decided that your students need to be able to name 3 types of transportation: air, land, and water. They need to be able to give you 3 examples of how people can move about in each of these 3 venues. You may expect them to be able to calculate the distance and the time it would take to get from Miami to San Francisco using these 3 different venues of transportation, and thereby tying in some math objectives. So you might have all kinds of objectives that are associated with this transportation unit that you're teaching over the course of 2 or 3 weeks, right? At the end, you're going to want to be able to ascertain how many students in your classroom can name through the 3 types of transportation, can identify 3 forms of vehicles that go with each of those groups, and so on and so forth. Are you with me? You do that because you're through teaching transportation, and you've got to figure out how much each of your kids learn so you can assign them a grade, right? That is called summative evaluation. You've presented the whole thing, you've taught everybody as much as you can teach them, and now you're taking a look to see that hopefully everybody has mastered the unit objectives that you have set for this instructional unit, right? Formative evaluation, though, is also very, very important. This is the thing that lets you know as you go along who's getting it and who's not. Formative evaluation is much more likely to be associated with the guided practice and maybe even the independent practice of the lesson cycle. But certainly when we do guided practice with students, we engage in guided practice for the specific purpose of determining who's getting it and who isn't, so that if we find that certain students have not mastered the objectives that we've established for that lesson, we can go back and reteach that before we take an assessment and run the risk of that student failing because they didn't measure the objectives as they go along. If you will recall, earlier in here we talked about the assess and progress method of teaching. And if there is one thing that absolutely certifies that your low achieving students will continue to fail, it is the assess and progress method of teaching. I can tell you they're not all going to get it the first time. And if you're not thinking about taking formative looks at who's getting it and who's not, and what you can do to ensure that the ones who are not get it, if you don't do that along the way, I can absolutely certify for you that you will assess and progress and have to assign grades, letting the chips fall where they may. So formative evaluation is extremely important if you want to bring the low achievers and the children with learning disabilities along in your classroom, because they're not all going to get it the first time. If they did, you would be moving at such a slow pace that the kids who already knew it would be turning over the tables in your classroom. You've got to assess and reteach using many of the ones who have already gotten it to do higher level things, and using some of the ones who are good peer tutors to reteach, and using more hands-on activities to reteach, so that when you get to the end, and you can use lots of your cooperative learning strategies for this purpose, so that when you get to the summative evaluation at the end, everybody, or a vast majority of all students, will have mastered the objectives that you set for the lesson. Some other types of assessment, and some of these have characteristics of either summative or formative evaluation, are curriculum-based assessment. This is very akin to Criterion Reference testing, because the test is based on the curriculum materials that are being used in class. Another type of assessment that has become very, very popular, I guess would be the best word. It's become very, very popular and also very useful for children who are low achievers, is a technique called competency-based measurement. We actually have a faculty member in the Ed Psych department, Dr. Ramirez, whose specialty is competency-based measurement. She's already forgotten more about it than I'll ever know. But for those of you who are taking your specialization in special ed, you will have a whole course on competency-based measurement. And for those of you who have an elective, it's really, really a useful technique for you to know as teachers. But the major characteristic of competency-based measurement is that the teacher takes frequent direct measures of student progress on long-term objectives. These are primarily in the curriculum areas of math, reading, and writing, and other language arts skills. But you teach and you test, and you teach and you test, and you teach and you test, so that you're really seeing that your short-term instructional objectives for students are being mastered, so that in the end they will be able to achieve the long-term curricular goals that you may have established for them over the course of the year. We'll revisit this in greater detail in just a minute. It comes up again in a more thorough discussion later in this chapter. But performance assessments are other kinds of instructional assessment techniques that we use. And in fact, when you get into further into Quest 1 and Quest 2, you'll find that for evaluating our teachers in our teacher education program here at the University of Houston, we use a combination really of performance and portfolio assessments. The performance aspect of it relies on relevant instructional materials that elicit students' responses to real-world tasks in real-life settings. This is the sort of authentic assessment that allows us to put a teacher in a school situation confronted with teaching learning experiences and new information, and let them try that out in the new situation. And you know, it's been a very successful program so far, and I think you will really like it when you get there, because all of a sudden you're hearing about all of these things and you're actually getting to move into a school situation where you can try things out on a regular basis to see how they provide real-life solutions to real-life problems. And it also allows the faculty to evaluate your performance in terms of your ability to problem solve and apply best practices in real-life case applications. So performance assessment is one side of what we do in Quest 2. The other side of what we do is the portfolio assessment. And portfolios, whether they're used for young adults or children in your classroom, portfolios are usually curriculum-based, systematic and organized collections of a student's work that is collected over time and displayed in some way that attests to what the student can and can't do. And of course your objective in by the time you finish Quest 3 is to come out with a portfolio that is based on performance assessments that you can take to a principal and say, look, can I do classroom management? Let me show you what I've done in classroom management. Can I do modifications for students who are behind? Let me show you what I've done. And so you have this right here to provide evidence in light of student outcomes about what you can accomplish as a teacher. But these things are equally as useful in evaluating your third graders or your fourth graders or your eighth graders, because they too will benefit from the constructivist type activities that involve performance assessments, and also many of them, particularly in visual performing arts, science, may do very well with the portfolio of what they've learned. So these kinds of assessments will be very relevant to you. Regardless of the type test that you use, you will need to ascertain that your test has a measure of reliability and validity, because if they don't, no matter how wonderfully they're constructed or how detailed the information you get, without reliability and validity, they're not very useful for anything. They don't give you information that is very useful. Now, it is very important for you to be able to distinguish reliability from validity and be able to define either one. And I'll give you a little example, and you'll never forget reliability and validity as long as you live. But first of all, by way of definition, reliability is really the extent to which a test is consistent in what it measures. If you give somebody an IQ test and they make 110 today, and they make 130 tomorrow, and they make 95 the day after that, it can't be a very good test, can it? Because with just one administration, you really have no idea how they did on the test. So for a test to be useful, it has to be reliable. You have to make the same score on it over and over and over and over. We judge reliability in terms of what is called the standard error of measurement, and that might be in the category of TMI, more information than you need. But the standard error of measurement on a well-standardized test is usually about plus or minus 3. So I would assume if I gave you an individualized intelligence test and you made 115, that your true score was within the range of that standard error of measurement, which would be about 112 to 118 would be your true score. In other words, if somebody else gave it to you, they'd probably get about 112 to 118. If you woke up on a different side of the bed tomorrow and you went to take the test, you'd probably, if it was a bad day, you might make 112. If you were really hot that day, had a good breakfast, you might make 118. But we have to assume that if a test is going to be useful, that it has a high measure of reliability, that no matter who administers it and under what range of normal situations, the subject who's being tested is going to earn the same score. Now, the other thing is, the same score doesn't mean anything unless we're really measuring what we say we're going to measure. And in some educational constructs, we do better at that than we do in other educational constructs. When we talk about measuring IQ, we probably don't measure IQ very well. It's sort of an amorphous construct. People have been arguing for 50 years over what it is, and nobody really agrees. And the definition is pretty simplistic, the extent to which an individual can adapt to their environment. You know, that's pretty amorphous right there. So we probably IQ tests suffer. They're very well standardized and very carefully norm referenced, and they're very reliable, but we don't know for sure what we're measuring. On the other hand, achievement tests are probably pretty valid. We all can agree kind of on what's average performance for a fifth grader. There's a lot of, well, what we call, this is another TMI thing, but what we call content validity. I mean, you can look at the fifth grade curriculum and tell what it is, so it's not quite so hard as it is with IQ to see if you're really measuring it, right? So this is a little bit easier with some educational constructs than it is with others. But now let me ask you this question. Can you have reliability without validity? Can you have validity without reliability? Are these codependent, if you will, constructs? You know, don't you?
No, I'm just guessing.
What's your guess?
That you cannot have reliability without validity, but you could have validity without reliability.
Okay, let me give you an example. She guessed that you can't have reliability without validity, but you can have validity without reliability. Let me give you an example that will freeze this in your mind for the rest of your life. How tall are you?
5'7".
She's 5'7". Have you all ever seen those square yardsticks you get at the rodeo? They're cute, 1-inch cubes. They herd cows with them. Well, they have such a thing. It's a yardstick. It's 3 feet long. So say I have one of those things, and she tells me she's 5'7", and so I'm going to put it to the test and see if she is 5'7". So I stand her up against the wall, level my yardstick down, make a mark on the wall, go back, measure. I say, honey, you're already shrinking. You're just 5'6". She says, no, I'm 5'7". I say, well, I'll check again. Looks like 5'6" to me, but I'll check again. So I get out my yardstick and I measure again, and guess what? 5'6". So you better start taking Fosamax. You're already shrinking. She says, I am not shrinking. I just got my driver's license last month. It says right here I'm 5'7". Well, you're 5'6" today. She says, you just don't know how to do it. I say, okay, so I let Kim do it. She's very perfectionistic, likes to do everything right. So Kim measures her. Guess what? She's shrinking. Still 5'6". So we go through this 2 or 3 times. She decides the mark on the wall's wrong, so we measure the mark again. Sure enough, we're just right there within a 32nd of an inch, right where we're supposed to be, and she's still 5'6". What if I tell you now that my ex-husband, I just remembered, cut the end off that yardstick and used the end of it to shim up a piece of furniture so it wouldn't, the table leg wouldn't rock? I would get the same measure over and over and over, but my yardstick isn't any good, right? My yardstick wouldn't be good. So reliability is a necessary but insufficient condition for validity. It's just the reverse of what you thought originally, but most people think that. They think, gosh, you have to be able to measure. You know, you have to have validity to have reliability. But in fact, you really don't. You can get the same IQ test score on somebody over and over and over and over and over because it's a very well constructed test, but it may not measure what it's supposed to measure. So you can have reliability without validity, but you cannot have validity without reliability. And it's important for you to know this because we tend to think that test scores are absolute. If somebody says it's an IQ score, that must mean it's a measure of intelligence. If somebody says it's a measure of giftedness, we tend to think, oh, well, this means she's gifted. And it may not be all that valid. In fact, the area of the gifted is one area in which we probably make some of the most invalid assessments in all of education. We do identify people who excel in certain areas, but to think that we can identify all the components of giftedness that occur in our student population with the test we use is absurd. It's really invalid. So keep those things in mind about reliability and validity. Now, one of the things that your book talks about is making adaptations in tests for students who have special needs. And certainly with norm reference tests, we know that special needs students often have a great deal of difficulty that may limit the reliability and validity of their test scores. We may have trouble getting an accurate assessment on them. If they have a sensory deficit, we may not be able to get a valid score on them. If they're not cooperative, like autistic children are not cooperative, they may not be able to respond or be willing to respond to show us all of the things that we know. So lots of times youngsters who have language and communication difficulties or attentional problems, reading difficulties or whatever, may need modifications in the way we test them to gain some relative understanding about the extent to which they have expertise in the area that's being measured. I want you to think about something though. I want you to think about the implications of using modification with norm reference tests, and particularly we'll go more at the end of this section and talk about SAT test and ACT test and the modifications that are sometimes used. This is going to sound on the surface like a strange thing for me to say to you, and probably like something you wouldn't expect me to say. But I think if you'll listen to it and think about it, you'll see that what I have to say on this subject is worth your consideration. There are lots of implications for using modifications with students when it comes to interpreting the scores that they make on standardized norm reference tests. What we're doing in that case is saying that we don't think you can perform very well on this test if you don't have shortened testing sessions, for example. That is a very familiar one, the shortened testing sessions, because you have attention deficit issues. And so you let them work 15 minutes and then take a break and go back next time in 15 minutes and take a break and go back 15 minutes and take a break and so on and so forth. And so you find out that this student really scores very, very well under these testing circumstances. that the student knows way many more answers than you would have ever gotten from him if you would have given him this test all at one time like you did to everybody else. So you say about this little fella, hey, you know, he's scoring way above other third graders. He'll be fine in the fourth grade. So you plunk him down in the fourth grade without, but nobody sends the teacher the memo. Or the teacher gets the memo and ignores it. Right? So the teacher comes in and says, oh yeah, well if he had 15-minute sessions, he could do great, but if, you know, wishes were horses, everybody would ride. So we don't have time to do 15-minute sessions in here. You can forget that. So one of the things that you have to bear in mind, and this seems like a strange remark coming from somebody like me, but it's so important, you have to take this in mind. I'm all for giving the modifications on the way we assess people. But you have to then carry those modifications through to the real life environments in which they're going to use these skills. Because if you have a reader recorder to administer the SAT, you also need a reader recorder to help that student when that student gets to college or whatever. Which of course is one reason we have the Center for Students with Disabilities, and we're becoming much better at providing accommodations for people all along the way. But what we're saying with the standardized norm reference test is that under these conditions on this test, this individual compares this way to his or her same age peers. So when we run in all of a sudden a reader recorder to do the SAT test, then we have to say, boy, when this individual has a reader recorder, they're in the 90th percentile. But if we want this individual to excel in this population to which we're sorting him or her, we're going to have to provide the reader recorder, or we can't expect that level of performance. Does that make sense to you? Making accommodations on the test is just the start. It's not the end of anything. It's the start of things. It says, boy, if we're willing to make these accommodations, this is how well this person can do. But then we've got to follow through with saying, and this is how we can make these accommodations in this environment. So I want you to keep that in mind when you see the modifications that are often made with standardized tests, such as altering the time or the schedule at which the test is administered, providing more time for each of the component parts, spreading the test over shorter testing sessions, or even over several days, changing the setting so that the child is taking the test in a familiar environment or with a familiar examiner, in a smaller room, in a room that is more distraction-free, is testing in an individual venue instead of with a group, altering the presentation of the test, simplifying the language of the test so that the items are easier to understand, providing prompts and feedback to the student. Oftentimes, children who are autistic or children who have a great deal of learned helplessness really don't exhibit what they know unless you say, now you can do this, remember we've done this before, now think about it again, go back, try, think about it again. And then if you require them to, they can dig a little deeper and come up with more information. But we have to be willing to do these same things in the learning venue if we're going to say that this is a representation of what they know and what they can do. Sometimes we allow teachers to read the test and turn the test pages. Some children, particularly those with learning disabilities, have a hard time managing and orienting to the paper. We may want an audio tape or braille format or a large print format. of the test. If we have a student who has visual impairments, we may want to change the response formats and let a child with a reading disability answer orally. We may, some people have incredible trouble, and I had a college student with this issue one time. She had had an automobile accident and had a riding disability, and Scantron forms drove her crazy. I mean, it was real hard for her to bubble in the Scantrons. So, of course, I just let her write her answers on the test, and then we transferred it to a Scantron form at a later time. But if that accommodation had not been made for her, I don't think there's any way she could have demonstrated what she knew about the material in a reasonable amount of time. And even if I'd have given her all the time in the world, it was so frustrating for her to try to make her fine coordination bubble those things in. And of course it was foolish, yes.
But what I think is that sometimes we underestimate what the student can do. For example, I was a teacher aide for special kids, and I had to give a test for the third grader group. And they told me, okay, we are not supposed to bubble in. And I said, why not? Why you cannot bubble in the answer? And he said, and one of the students said, because the teacher always do it for me. And I said, well, this time everybody's gonna bubble in. From now on, you're gonna learn to bubble in. Okay, Miss Cardenas, do you think we can do it? Yes, you can. And everybody start bubbling from that day on. And then I spoke to the regular teacher, and the teacher said, oh, now everybody know how to bubble in because you teach them. And I said, yeah, but you were doing it all this time for them. That's what they think that they expected that they cannot do it. So I feel that we underestimate sometimes the students what they can do.
Well, that's such a life lesson about every student that you will ever encounter, that the art of requiring students to do everything they can do for themselves at a challenge level, and while not getting frustrated and discouraged. Do you see what I mean? That's what learning is moving forward at a pace where you're independently executing all the tasks that you're capable of. And of course, it's so hard since you will have 25 students, all with different strengths and weaknesses and different skills and abilities, some of whom exhibit learned helplessness about lots of things like bubbling in Scantron forms or whatever. And maybe the students couldn't have done that in the first grade. But by the time they were in the third grade, they're certainly able to, yet we don't require them to do that because we just assume they can't do it. And that is such an art in teaching, not only with children who are low achievers, but with everybody. We let bright children get away with murder all the time because we don't require them to work up to their levels. And many college students with a disability will tell you, if they were here talking to you, don't let them get by with anything. When I was in school, I could get away with murder. I'd tell them, oh, I can't do that, I can't do that. They'd say, oh, okay, we'll do it for you. So there is a level there at which we're sensitive to the things students really cannot do to exhibit their ability, and then the things that they manipulate us into doing it for them because it's just easier. And I know that. I had a lot of those characteristics myself as an only child. I was amazed at when I had children to think of all the things they could do by themselves that my mother did for me till I was 12 years old. I can remember her best friend saying one time, she's 12 years old, she's really old enough to dress herself. My mother was still dressing me when I was in middle school. Because I'd just sit there and sleep on the edge of the bed and she'd dress me. You probably had lots of brothers and sisters. Didn't get that. I know it's shocking, isn't it? But she did. And we do it to kids in school sometimes. All right, let's see here. Along the lines of having students prompted and encouraging them if they tend to have learned helplessness and give up, sometimes with autistic youngsters or others who are low achievers or not motivated, we can provide some motivational incentive to find out how much they know or don't know. We mentioned familiarity of the examiner earlier, so I'm going to not dwell on that anymore. Your book talks specifically about accommodations that are administered for students on the SAT and the ACT. For those of us who are preparing students, even in middle school, for this type nationwide testing, I think it's important for you to know that the major accommodations made on these tests are such things as extended time, large type, alternative test forms, if provided that they're called for in a student's IEP, a reader or recorder, an audio cassette to accompany the written form, magnifying glasses, and 4-function calculators. These are the major accommodations that are used for the standardized tests that are the gateway to universities. But once again, keep in mind that accommodations of this nature do violate the standardization procedures used for test scoring, and so we have to interpret our results accordingly. Your book talks a little bit about competency-based and statewide assessments. As most of you know by now, in Texas those are referred to as the TOCs. But certainly these statewide competency tests are meant to establish educational accountability, and we expect all students to pass these tests in order to be promoted or to graduate or to move on to the next grade or whatever. We do allow for adaptations for students with special needs, but still try to maintain the standardization as an important concern in this competency testing. Basically what we're saying when we certify a child to take the test with accommodations is that we are holding you accountable for mastering the same amount of information. We still expect you to master these instructional objectives, but we want to give you some variation in the response alternatives that are acceptable for exhibiting your knowledge. And many, if not most of these modifications have to do with students who are certified as having learning disabilities, and they mimic some of the things we were talking about earlier, like administering fewer subsections in one testing session, providing at least one example for each set of items so you're certain that the student knows how to answer the item, if it's a multiple choice item or a short answer item or whatever. Sometimes items are grouped together to measure similar skills, and then they are presented in a hierarchical level of difficulty so that the students won't encounter the hardest question first and then give up before he tries anymore. We talked about bubbling in earlier. Sometimes all of the information on one page is left justified because students with learning disabilities sometimes have difficulty reading one column and then going to the next column. They may read one column and then turn the page and get their Scantron form out of whack. Arrows may be indicated on the test or even drawn on it to show the student exactly where to go next, so that particularly if it's not left justified, they don't leave anything out. Or throw off their answers, worse than that, throw off their answers so that everything they write after that is wrong. Have any of you ever gotten on the wrong line in on a Scantron form? It is enough to drive you crazy, and it will take sometimes half of the test time to go back and get it straightened out. That happened to me once. I can't remember what I was taking the test in, but I just skipped item 48 or whatever it was, and so all of my test items were one, and I got all the way to the bottom, and there was a space there, you know, for another answer, and I was a raving maniac. You know, I felt the time running out, and I was trying to erase. It's hard to erase on those things, so sometimes the arrows and things like that can be very helpful to keep children with disabilities from getting lost, and that really isn't an indication of anything that they know or don't know. Certainly, we use the same kinds of modifications that we've been talking about with the GED, which is really a minimum competency test. Many low achievers will end up taking the GED at some juncture after they've dropped out of school, I'm sorry to say. Your book talks quite a bit about teacher-made tests. We're going to get an opportunity in your guided practice to learn some more about teacher-made tests, but you will find that probably that you rely fairly heavily on teacher-made tests, and there are some modifications that you can make that increase the probability that low-achieving students will do well on them. Studies have shown that it's helpful for students if the teacher does make some of these format modifications, and that they are able to express more of what they know. If the teacher-made tests are typewritten and not handwritten, this is so easy now in this day and age of word processing that of course I can't imagine anybody handwriting anything. All I do is word process all day, every day. But space items sufficiently apart that you don't have interference from one item to the next. Make sure that you provide spaces for the student to respond on the test itself, and preferably immediately under the question that's asked. Provide your items once again in a predictable hierarchy of difficulty, and administer more tests with fewer items rather than fewer tests with longer items. Sometimes in here, when there's enough weeks in the semester, I give 3 tests in here because I think it's easier. You know, I think it's easier for students to do. Learn 4 chapters at a time rather than 6. We just didn't have time this semester because I had to tape all of the sessions during the regularly scheduled tape day, but probably would be a better indication of student achievement if I had 3 tests rather than 2. If you are not administering a test specifically to determine how well a student can read, you might want to adjust the reading level of the items or provide a reader for the student so that the test does not become a test of reading achievement rather than a test of social studies or science or whatever. You may want to provide, particularly in your formative evaluation sections, guided practice or study or whatever, a sample of a well-responded test item so that you know the student knows how to write what he knows down. You may need to provide a quiet place or administer the test individually, or sometimes there are places in schools where kids can go to take the test under more private circumstances. And sometimes we may want to allow a child to respond by using a tape recorder or some other method rather than writing if the writing interferes with the child's ability to express what he knows. Now then, we're right now to the point of talking about curriculum-based assessment. So I'm going to stop right now for our break, come back, talk about curriculum-based assessment, and do our guided practice. We still have quite a bit left in this chapter, but let's have our break now.